All right, everyone, good afternoon. My name is Amy Wolf, and I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for being here today, and to our friends on Zoom, thank you so much for being here as well. Today, we have the pleasure of having Alexander Brash, author of A Whaler at Twilight, with us today. Mr. Brash was born and raised in New York, New York. An early love for birds evolved into a passion for quantitative, hope I said that right, community ecology, and then a devotion to conservation. Along the way, he worked on Great Gull Island in the American Museum of Natural History and graduated from Buckley School, Hotchkiss School, Connecticut College, Yale School for the Environment, and worked on a PhD at Rutgers University. After a hurricane wiped out his study site, he took a job with the New York City Parks and rose to be the chief park ranger, managing the agency's uniformed officers, natural resource group, communications, historic house trust, and special events. At New York City Parks, he initiated the Forever Wild project, now 47 park preserves covering over 8,700 acres. Project X, the city's first program to reintroduce extirpated,
Got it.
thank you, species. And he was a first responder on 9/11. After nearly 2 decades in New York, he joined the National Parks Conservation Association as the Northeast Regional Director, lobbying for our national parks, particularly bringing attention to the system's urban parks and cultural icons, as well as initiating the effort to establish Katahdin Woods, Stonewall Inn, and Patterson Falls as new national parks. Alex then spent 3 years as president of Connecticut Audubon, which he reinvigorated by moving its finances into the black, tripling its endowment, doubling the size of its nature preserves, and realigning its educational programs with STEM. Retired in Connecticut, he has been consulting, writing, traveling, birding, and spending time with family. Happily married to Jane, they have 2 great children, Ian and Emily. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alexander Brash.
Thank you, Amy. That's very nice, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm Alex Brash. Let me introduce you to my fellow co-author. This is my great-great-grandfather, Robert Armstrong, to my right. And today we're going to talk about the book that we both just put out that really chronicles his tale, mostly or is focused on his 10 years in the South Pacific, but obviously it's a slightly wider perspective. And then what I did was add not only a lot of historical context, but also, thankfully, some of my reflections on the whole journey, particularly as a conservationist. It's reasonably informal, and I think I'm a pretty easy person. So you're all welcome. You know, if you have a question, raise your hand. If you don't hear something, please speak up. And to those of you who are Zooming, thank you for joining us. Let me just begin with a quote, and this is not my writing. It's a famous quote. I think it'll ring with most of you. And the reason I picked it, you'll see, is on the surface, it's obviously very topical to the story. But more importantly, it brings out 2 more facets, if you will, of the tale. And one is that the tale harkens us back to a period long ago. And I think in a way you'll see in my reading that it's something that will harken you back to your childhood or high school experience. And then secondly, of course, the core element of the piece I'm going to read is really about redemption, which is the heart of this story. Is it he, quoth he, is this the man by him who died on the cross? With his cruel bow he laid full low the harmless albatross. The spirit who bideth by himself in the land of mist and snow, he loved the bird that loved the man who shot him with the bow. The other was a softer voice, as soft as honey dew. Quoth he, The man hath penance done, and penance more will do. That, of course, from your high school days is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. With that. Oh, one. No. Ah. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Amy. So while I was working my PhD at Rutgers, one of the things I learned to do was teach. And so as any good teacher, I hope you'll sympathize. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you as I tell you. So a quick synopsis as we go through this. First, we're going to talk about finding the manuscript that formed the basis of this tale, a little bit on the background of my great-grandfather and the Armstrongs who came, a quick primer on whaling, so you have it in context, something very near and dear. And to be clear, the story actually originated right near here. Rob's tale itself, briefly, is a quick synopsis of what he did for his 10 years across the South Pacific. And then what I like to call a quick historical tripod. The tripod is a whaling term. The tripod on a whaling ship was the big black cauldrons into which they threw the oil, which they threw the blubber to boil it down to the oil. So there's a quick boiling down of some of the stories within his story. Then I call the philosophical gurry. The gurry is another whaling term. After you flensed the whale and you boiled the whale down and you threw what's left over the sides, the decks were a mess with the blood and guts, and that was called the gurry, and then they cleaned them off. And so the final bit is my philosophical gurry, looking at the blood and guts of the story, and then we're open for questions. In a quick context, just as we go forward, I think what's helpful is sort of the history. So I'll point out, Robert Armstrong was born in 1828, which is fascinating. It's at the cusp of really the American history. It's the end of the founding fathers, the last of the Jefferson and Adams and so forth have all just passed, and it's a new America. I mean, Andrew Jackson has come in. It's a, expansionist. It's a whole different America. They're looking to basically move west, of course, push out the remaining colonial nations, Spain and England, who still have holdings and so on. And then, of course, put its eye on the Pacific Ocean. He heads out ultimately in 1849, and he sails for 10 years. Well, he sails for 6 of them and he logs for 4, but he's gone for 10 years and comes back in 1859, which is, right in the heart of the turmoil before the American Civil War. He, by then is too old, but in 1865, he ultimately gets married, thank gosh. So I'm sort of giving away because he actually comes back, but if you thought about it, I wouldn't be telling the tale if he hadn't come back. So it's not too much of a first blush. And then he himself dies in 1902. In 1902. There's a little context to remember. So the story, in many ways, began really right near here. It began in Provincetown in a funny way. I will preface that a little bit by saying I was, as you know, born and raised in New York City. As I said, I became interested in birds for whatever unknown reason very early. I managed in high school and college to get a job and worked in the lovely American Museum of Natural History. There I am on the left in college. I'm the one with the binoculars. With my friends, we were pretending to be the professors for some odd reason. We were shooting off rockets, but as you can see. But it was in that stage that I then worked, as I said, in the Museum of Natural History. And one of my jobs every day was to move the bird trays. And at the time, I'll try to pick some birds you all know. Here's a good example. Herons, great blue herons or egrets, you know what they all look like. Mm-hmm. And then you might have next to that a stork, which looks different. We don't have them around here, but down south you have the wood stork. And then you have something like a vulture, which we've all seen the turkey vultures. Well, historically, everyone always thought that the herons were related to the storks, which makes sense. They look like each other. But in fact, in the middle of the 1980s, as DNA was first being used to start looking at evolutionary characters and relationships, they realized that in fact, storks were more closely related to vultures. Now, what does that mean? That means some poor schmuck like me in the museum, as this little teenager, and these trays were bigger than I was, had to then move all the storks from the herons to near the vultures. And so I spent spring breaks, Christmas breaks, summer breaks, doing that. I mean, it was fascinating. It was a wonderful experience. Don't mean to make light of it, but the joy to me was I got to hear lectures from famous ornithologists who came in, and then at lunchtime, take my sandwich and wander the halls. And my favorite hall to go to was the one up here in the upper right. And it's called the Ship Followers, and it is really about the pelagic seabirds that are far away. In this case, it is in fact a hypothetical fishing boat or made up fishing boat, but it's well off the south coast of New Zealand and has probably the greatest diversity of seabirds of anywhere in the world, next to maybe Cape Horn, which also is in the story. The diorama depicts the soaring pelagic seabirds over deep troughed green-hued seas from the perspective of a fictitious schooner off the southern coast of New Zealand. As far away from the museum as one might be, in the farthest wilds of the Antipodes. In stark contrast to Holden Caulfield, who loved these same halls for their temporal cessation, bringing him peace amid his juvenile angst. As a youth, I readily imagined the opposite. I knew the birds actually flew between my visits. They were all so alive to me. Once I left the hall, I was sure they resumed their endless quests across the tempestuous seas. And then, as a grad student, I was at Yale School of Environment. It was actually School of Forestry then, but Yale School of Environment. And one of the things I did was I took on, as a grad student, I took on the sort of fun task of going off and leading various bird tours and bird walks. And one of them I hooked up with a fellow marine mammologist at the University of Rhode Island, and we came up and we did a series of tours with customers, clients. We weren't paid, we were doing volunteer, but anyway, they were constituents, clients, something. Off Provincetown, we went out in the dolphin whaling fleet, which I'm sure many of you have been on, and it's just a fantastic thing. And on my first trip on the dolphin whaling sheet, I, was pointing out the various shearwaters and the petrels and so forth. And my compatriot was pointing out the beautiful humpback whales and so forth, and the right whales going by. And for me, it was the first time. I'd never seen a whale that big, that close. And, what it evoked out of me was, I was just so amazed and impressed by their intelligence. They came right up by the ship, they looked us over, they watched. This one whale sort of almost spy hopped at us and watched one side, and the guy next to me moved to take pictures. You could see its eye following it, and then I realized we were okay, and it sunk under the ship, came up on the other side and did the same thing. And, it made me sort of totally reevaluate not only whales, but sort of our whole relationship with whales and within the animal kingdom and intelligence and all those kind of big questions. In any event, we finished the trip, went home, and that night I called my mother and my father, and I said, wow, I just went on this great thing, and there were incredible whales, and you should have been there, kind of thing. As I wrote about it, the morning's warm air off the cool ocean over the cool ocean waters off Cape Cod in late May had created a heavy fog that hovered just above the sea. The sunlight slipping through the haze reflected tantalizingly off the waves and created a luminous silvery sheen with a blinding effect. Dazzled by the glare, I stared into the dark waters, then gasped. A great eye, smoky gray and opaque, the size of a dinner plate, stared at me as it ascended from the ocean's depths. It was curious, not a hint of malevolence. When its rostrum broke the surface, the scores of ivory-colored barnacles peppering its head resolved themselves and elicited a moment of deep sympathy. The rising mass created a swirling eddy, and from the murky waters, its two great white-edged flippers materialized, each 15 feet long and also barnacle encrusted. This humpback whale, near enough to touch, was my first great cetacean, so close at hand. It was mesmerizing both for its colossal size and for immediately imparting an impression of curiosity. So as I said, I got back and called my parents about it and babbled on for, as I just did. And my mother said, you know, you have a whaler in your background. I said, what? She said, you have a whaler in your background. I said, nah. And I, of course, as one does, put it off, the lark of youth. And didn't really think about it and went on with life and kept working and, you know, had kids and so on and so forth. And then when I finally retired about 5 or 6 years ago, went back and luckily my mother, 97, still alive. And she said, you know, we've got this whaler map. So she said, well, let me see the map. Little did I know, beneath the map in the trunk, in her back of her closet, which she pulled out, was also a 100-page manuscript, handwritten manuscript. So pulled that out, and I spent the next 3 months going through the whole thing and digitizing it. And then, of course, discovered it was a really fascinating story in itself. That he did in fact use a lot of proper nouns and context and places and things. And so, you know, that drew me out to then do the background research and follow up on it, which I did. And spent almost the next 3 years going through. And what was fascinating was I went back and further in the trunk, which was all her worldly possessions that she'd been carried through several generations, was also an old little monograph put together for the whaler's uncle, who had started one of the first big, what they call a millinery store, but it was equivalent of a Macy's, let's say, in Baltimore. And they wrote it, which was very helpful. Seemed silly, but it was very helpful actually trying to trace who they all were in the family and name and how they came over from Ireland the turn of the century. A copy of his will over on the left side. There were a few letters that he wrote, Robert Armstrong. And then, of course, one of the great thankful advantages, having been a Yale forestry or Yale graduate student, I had free access as an alumnus to these sort of online research engines and could go back and find stuff. And I will say, you couldn't have done what I did 10 years ago. I mean, the amount of stuff that now that all these libraries have put out and digitized is phenomenal. And I'll even thank one in short course. So with that, I sort of then began to put it all together. And went my way through his story. Quick one. I'll just give this little context, simply put, this is the, you saw him earlier, this is the whaler, his wife. The young lad, and this picture is probably taken about 1900. The young lad right there is my grandfather, so his grandson. And that is that same young lad back in the 1940s, which is my grandfather, and his daughter is my mother. So it seems distant, you know, it seems 150 years back, but it's really not that far since, you know, I at least knew sort of half these people in my time. And then this is sort of a quick, what's fascinating early on is the Armstrongs come over from Ireland. They're sort of a long story, but they were actually, the family were reavers from Scotland, which is to say in the turn about the 1600s. They basically lived on the border and they ran over the borders and they stole cattle and everything they could from the English, and it wasn't very pretty. And then along comes King James, who then unites both thrones. And since he's sitting on both thrones, he's like, well, I can't have my left hand stealing from my right hand now that I run both of you. So he sent his army down and they wiped out all the reavers and they basically hunted all the Armstrongs down. And most of them they hung, and the few that were remaining, women and children at best, but ran away, and a good number of them went to Northern Ireland. So the family was there for years, and they're kind of lost in the midst of times there. But they do trace back, and then they end up coming over. The whaler's grandfather comes over at the turn of the century in 1799, or at least shows up early in 1799 in Baltimore. And Baltimore And then he has three sons, and the whaler is the product of the third son. And the whaler, his parents died when he was very little. His mother died when he's 4, and his father dies when he's 9, I think it's right. And then he ends up living with his uncle, and one of his uncles has no children, lucky for him, actually, because he's willing to take them in. But the Baltimore he grew up in, of course, is, as I said, it's on that cusp of American history. It's very fascinating. The Baltimore, is basically began to grow and expand because what was it? It was the northernmost harbor that was still ice-free. And it also directly fed originally just, over the mountain passes, but it fed the Midwest grain to ships going off to Europe. In due course, that's why the nation's first railroad was built there, that then went up and connected all the way through to the Mississippi River. But in the day, it's all sailing ships. It's wagons and carts and barrels and young men are coming in from the hills in Appalachia every day, and they're wearing buckskins, and they're bringing in, wild game and food to feed the town. So it's still pretty early. This is a slightly later picture. That's 1878. Most of his youthful days, Rob and his friends rumbled in the streets, no doubt running errands and delivering groceries, but also rolling hoops, playing catch, or flicking marbles. As they ran along the crowded ways, they were immersed in the cacophony of clanging of ships' bells, the booming cracks of sails snapping in the wind, and the loud ringing of the wagon's great iron wheels rolling along the cobblestones. Near the docks and along Baltimore Street, the drovers shouted at their beasts and snapped their whips as they struggled to get their teams underway. These weren't fancy horses around the docks, not the trotters and the high steppers attached to the buggies and landaus up the hill, but mostly huge workhorses such as Percherons and Clydesdales. It should have been a great place and a wonderful time to grow up in, exciting and fresh, a new nation on the cusp of its being. And that's part of my context on all this was going back and visiting many of these places. Obviously, Baltimore is one, and I've been there several times. As I said, my grandfather was actually born in this house, which was the whaler's last house. But as a youth, the whaler ran around Baltimore Harbor bottom. He actually was born in a house up near the building with the blue glass, but ran on those streets, Light Street and so forth in the harbor. Later, when he came back from whaling and settled down, he and his wife had their own store, which was in this site, probably not that building, in this site. As you can see, Baltimore still struggles. This house is actually where he lived at the end of his life when he was more successful. He and his wife's store did pretty well. And I think when his uncle finally passed, having no heirs, they probably picked up something more. And so the end of his life, he and his family were in both these houses. The oldest daughter, who was my line, and her husband and my grandfather were all in one of them. He was in the other, but 4 of the other kids were all in there also at the same time. And then even today, he lies south of Baltimore in a graveyard that looks back on the city. Before we leave Baltimore, as I said, his parents die when he's young, and his uncle takes him in, and his uncle is very kind and does reasonably well and puts him in the nation's first dental school, which was in Baltimore, is now part of the University of Maryland. And he luckily graduates, and he actually early on falls in with a group of guys, and he hangs out and they work with a church, and they set up a local ship as a chapel so that they can help bring God to sailors coming in. It was a very, of course, God-fearing time. And then when he finishes dental school, he's now fallen in with a bad crowd. And so he becomes a drunkard. And he cannot handle his alcohol. He manages to pick up and get his first job, and he moves with a partner, another graduate at the time, and their first job of all places to go, because this is where his friend is from, of all places to go, his first job as a dentist is in Bourbon County, Kentucky. Not good for a drunkard. So he lasts there about 6 months and his friend says, you know, you're riding drunk on the horse. Everyone knows it. They don't want you to touch their teeth. So he leaves. He comes back to Baltimore. His head in hand. He's deeply embarrassed. He swears he's going to be good. His uncles believe in him a little bit enough, or someone does, and the faculty of the school reach back and they, okay, you sure? It's like, yes, I'm good. I'm not gonna go back that way. So they hook him up and he now goes and works with another previous alumnus who's an older man down in South Carolina. And he goes down and the older man, is still dentist, but he's too old to go on the horse. So he keeps the practice in the city and he sends young Armstrong out on the horse every day to do visits in the field. And after 3 months, the same thing happens and he, is back to drinking heavily and everyone calls him in. And then he's too embarrassed, of course, to go home. He's way too embarrassed to go back to Baltimore. He shamed his community. Reading between the lines, I suspect there was a lot more incidents that had happened in Baltimore. Because when he returns 10 years later, no one will talk to him. I mean, he even recounts that, people whisper and the kids run away. So he must have been his time, stolen money, abused people, whatever it may be. He was a bad drunk. So in any event, he leaves South Carolina, won't go to Baltimore. He goes to New York City and he drinks himself under the table with all the money left in his pockets. And he wakes up the next morning in the streets and he sells his tools, his dental tools. So that ends his career. And drinks himself under the table, and now he wakes up penniless, too ashamed to go home. So he goes down to what would have been the equivalent of Times Square or whatever it was, and signs up to go to Whaler. And so they put him on a train up to New Bedford, and he heads up to New Bedford in December 1849. He writes, "There was still hope. There was still a door of hope open to me, that in my pride I would not enter. On reaching New York, I went to one of the best hotels and began to drink harder than ever until my money was gone. Next, I sold my dental instruments, my watch, and everything I possessed. And then when all was gone in December 1849, I sold myself to a whaling agent and found myself, I hardly knew how, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, bound for a whaling voyage on the bark Smyrna under Captain Rudolphus H. Tobey. Not having the money to buy liquor with, I necessarily sobered up before the Smyrna sailed and took occasion to write to my 2 uncles in Baltimore, who had shown me such unwavering and undeserved kindness. These proved to be the only letters they received from me until my return home 9.5 years later." So he gets to Baltimore and heads out. Here's an old picture on the upper left, which is reasonably interesting. Also, not obviously also for the ships, but in the day. But the number of barrels you see there is about 1,000 barrels of oil, which is about, on average, what a whaling ship would bring back after 4 years on a voyage. So that was, it's sort of a neat capture. It's the capture of a ship that has returned. They've unloaded all the barrels, and that would have been, 4 years of work. The same docks are there today. The fleet's changed, no longer whaling. It's obviously off, as we know, cod and pollock and so forth off of here. That's a picture of Old New Bedford. And you can see when you look at it today, it's beautifully preserved at the National Park site. And same buildings are there, same windows. It looks, immaculately well protected. And Park Service has done a great job of sort of preserving historic New Bedford. And while I was in New Bedford, I then said, well, if I'm here and I'm visiting, I've got to go see, the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And without really getting into great details, I said I'd like to go into the library and I want to do some background check. And here's the name of the ships he was on. And they said, oh, come on in. So I did. And there's a picture of the library. And I sit down with the librarian. I say, here are the ships, and he points out, here's the indices over here on this cabinet, and here's the microfiche over here, and here's some of this other stuff. So what exactly? I said, well, I have this manuscript from my great-grandfather, Robert Armstrong. And the librarian goes, we have his logs. I said, no, you don't have his logs. Okay, there's, Robert Armstrong, common name, you don't have his logs. No, we have his logs. So we go in the back and they pull him out his logs. I'm like, how? And I sat down, it took me 3 months to figure it out, going through sort of family history and then reading a letter or two that were attached and some that were my logs. So when the whaler finally dies in 1902, he has had 6 kids. The oldest daughter, the oldest child, who's the daughter, from whom I'm descended, she clearly said, okay, you can imagine kids doing this when any of us go to heaven, they divvy up the pot. So the oldest daughter says, I'll take the autobiography. The next 2 are boys, they don't care. The next one down is another daughter, and she says, oh, I'll take that logbook. So she takes that logbook. And then another boy, he doesn't care. And then the youngest, who is a son, the youngest child says, okay, I'll take the other log, and he takes the log. And they all go their separate ways. And then ultimately, about 35 years later, I'm from what I can piece together, somewhere in 1935-ish, as I said, the middle daughter, who has this log, is still interested. So she writes to her younger brother, and they're all out in Indianapolis and in the Midwest. And she says, can I borrow this book back? Can I borrow your log back so I can make a copy and look at it? And so he sends it to her. She makes a copy, early on Xerox, makes a copy and sends the original back, which is lost. But she has one original and one copy of the other log, and it stays in her family. And her granddaughter-in-law, in roughly 2005, realizes no one left the family cares, but they're really interesting, and she sends them to New Bedford. And so it all gets reunited, which is fascinating. And of course, it's very helpful to me because I have the original, what he wrote. When he wrote it, he had these 2 logs, of course, but he wrote his autobiography, if you will, the larger 100-page manuscript, when he's in his 60s, and he's based it on these 2 logs, but pulls it all together.
Is he captain?
Is he?
The captain?
No, he is a lowly seaman, never doing, but having been at dental school, he's probably one of the few educated. And these were not, to be clear, I'll come back to that. These were not the official ship's logs,
Okay.
which I found. This is modeled. He must have been friends enough with the captain, and maybe he wrote the log for the captain, but they're not the original logs, which I have one of them. But this is modeled after what you would see in a real captain's log, where they do this kind of stuff. This is just, we were here, we did that and the other, so they're not the official logs. I will give credit to the actually Nantucket Historical Society, because the Nantucket Historical Society, when I did this and then later was trying to find, to your question, where are the captain's logs? On his first ship, I can't find it. There's indices you can get online and stuff. No one knows where that is. On his second ship home, that captain's log Nantucket had. And so I called them up and I said, and they said, oh yeah, we have it right here, blah, blah, blah. And it was, February, 3 or 4 years ago. I was like, okay, I'll get on the ferry and come up and visit Nantucket in February. And they were like, no, we are actually digitizing our stuff right now. Give me a minute. Would you hold on, Mr. Brash? I said, sure, I'll hold on. The nice librarian went, she found her supervisor, and she comes back 5 minutes later and she says, we've agreed, we'll move it up, we'll do your log next week. And they did and sent it to me. I sent them a nice contribution because they were wonderful, but they did his log, and I used bits of that log. I inserted a couple lines, not a lot, I mean, probably no more than a paragraph or 2, but in pieces, because that captain actually, I'll come to one of them, you'll see later in the story, but there were a couple things where he was a little bit clearer on, or emphasized differently, or shed a little more light on, and that was sort of added context. But anyway, it was all an amazing,
Like a relative was keeping basically a daily diary, put on a ship and following it along.
Yeah, well, a captain's log technically in the whaling world was part of the contract, which is really interesting because, the ship's owners are all hanging out back in Nantucket or New Bedford. And so by contract, the captain had to keep a log where they were every day to track what, what whales they took, how many barrels they collected, but that's what it was. I mean, basically, most captain's logs are more on this style. And they will, leaving out these pictures, what they'll have, but the elements that they all usually track were where they were, the latitude and longitude every day. True, one line on weather, southwest winds, gale force, not gale force, whatever, force 8, 6, 5, whatever it may be. They would track this, these are all ships they met. So another whale terminology is gamming, where two ships get together, two whaling ships get together, they're somewhere far away. And they agree they're gonna like hang out together for that night, and the boats will go back and forth between, and they'll swap letters and magazines and books, and the crews will talk and smoke and hang out, and the captains will share gamming. And so this is when they met ships at sea. Obviously, there's a similar page, which I don't have, but I have a cut of a whale, and how many barrels of oil they got from the whale. Those were really the principal elements of a whale's life, and that was it. So he, had a lot more context in his own stuff, which is what then comes out in the story.
Do you mind one more follow-up question to hers?
No,
So that these logs were really made for the investors. When did the investors get them? At the end of the
At the end of it.
voyage?
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
not when they went somewhere that they could be given to and had a meal distribution center.
No.
Oh. at the
No,
end.
no,
Okay.
there was no, and they didn't go near,
Boston Post Road?
there was no, yeah, exactly, there was no, he will tell you in his story, he actually wrote a bunch of letters over the 10 years. They would occasionally give them to other whaling ships that they were gamming with who were heading home. None of them ever got home. So none of that worked. So the whalers wouldn't. The only place, having now read 5 years of whaling stuff, or for 5 years having read all this whaling stuff, the only place that even begins to get to there and was not really on their circuit was Hawaii. Hawaii was a major port for its own fleet, had a fleet, and some of these ships would stop in there, and that was about the only place that you might actually have thought of doing that, but they never did. The log came home and then went to the owners like the day they landed. And so he sailed, as I said, in December 1849. Essentially, he sailed for 2.5 years on one ship. It was 3.5 years on one ship, the Smyrna. And he then gets off. He goes into New Zealand, which we'll get to, and he logs for 4 years, and then he's ready finally to go home, and he gets on another ship and comes back, and that's another 1.5 years. So he's sailing during, the golden years, and this I call my quick primer in whaling, because it's interesting. Of course, whaling has been around for thousands of years. Early Aborigines whaled for 5,000 years. At first, most of them, it was really just, people would find dead whales on a beach or whatever. Obviously, the first step after that was shore whaling, where you weren't going for the larger leviathans, you were going after, up on the edge of the Arctic, you're going after narwhals and beluga whales and that kind of stuff, which you could get from land, and obviously a lot of seals. And then, it begins only to take off really probably about 1000 AD do you first get some stuff. Even in early historical accounts, not much. The Native Americans are just beginning to do it in 1400s, 1500s. It's still very rare as Columbus comes over and Cabot and those people, and then it begins to pick up. And so I think it becomes sort of a dual thing. It had been going on in Europe for about a couple of 100 years because the Basques were the most notable ones, and they kind of wiped out, in fact, what was the gray whale. There was an Atlantic gray whale. Gray whale we all know from California, but there was an Atlantic version, and that its breeding grounds were in the Bay of Biscay between France and Spain, and they were all wiped out. But French kings were being served whale tongue in 1200 and 1300. And then that kind of disappeared. It moved up. Norsemen and various others took it over, and it was a little north of the Arctic. And then it moves over, and by the time you get to 1600s, the beginning of Nantucket and the whole history here, it really is sort of European knowledge, if you will, of sailing, combined with the Aborigines' greater skill set in seeing, hunting, harpooning, and so forth, which is always what was, which made a big element, which is also actually led to New Bedford being one of the most diverse and open-minded cities. It's not just the Quakers, but the very heart of whaling, particularly in Nantucket, where it really started. was the ships went out as a diverse crew. And so it was sort of always embedded to be a more open society, which is what made it very unique. I mean, later New Bedford becomes one of the most, anti-abolition cities. That's where Frederick Douglass settles for that very reason. It was the most open-minded. And it wasn't just because there were a lot of number of Quakers there. It was really more the whaling community had always been more open, and more inclusive. So whaling slowly takes off and then gets just whacked back to nothing, both in the American Revolution and subsequently the War of 1812. The nascent fleet gets just destroyed by the British. They catch them, they burn them. Of course, most of the sailors who were, more than half the sailors in 1776 were born in England, right? They've only come over, they're young colonists. So even though they think they're Americans, they're born in England. So we all know they all get impressed. And the Nantucket whaling fleet, the Bedford whaling fleet are like 7 ships at the end of 1812 and all that, or 1814. Picks up again, then you move in, of course, in the heyday. And then near the end, and I'll speed it up a little bit, you get what I call the untethered aspect of whaling. It was truly depressing. Distressingly, whaling became truly untethered in the 20th century. With oil fields opening across the nation, sperm whales lost their economic interest, and baleen whales were once again the target, but this time for their whalebone and meat. Whalebone was actually the baleen plates in the mouth, which were used in human goods where plastics or spring steel are employed today. Now sustained hunting shifted back to inshore species and brought the near annihilation of right and bowhead whales. Hunting for the remaining great baleen whales ratcheted up with high-powered harpoon guns and factory ships. In the final push, the blue, fin, and sei whales that had swum too fast for Rob's ships were now the quarry of modern high-speed diesel engine boats. Coupled with ice-breaking steel hulls, the specter of death now penetrated the great whale's last refugia, the polar regions. And so, the picture on the right shows the very end of whaling. If you think about it, the heyday was sort of the end of the 1880s, oil is discovered, it all kind of goes quiet, you think it goes away. World War I comes, that really sort of kiboshes what's left. I mean, the last wooden ship washed up, I think, in 1924, nearby. It's pretty gone. You go to World War II, and then at the end of World War II, what happens? You have all these surplus Navy ships from all these different fleets available. There's what I call the tragedy of commons. That is the belief that, no one owns the whales, right? They're free creatures of the sea. There's no one's whales, so we can all take as many as we want, and it's free meat. And we've got nothing else to do with, leftover crew from World War II, steel hulls, high-powered engines. So not only are going out, on the sailing ships, couldn't possibly keep up with a blue whale that went by at 30, 40 miles per hour. These guys, of course, motor right after. They can shoot them with the harpoon and they can winch them in. You don't have to go out in boats. It's not scary. More importantly, the steel hulls can also penetrate into both polar regions. And, the Arctic had been whaled somewhat in the end of the 1800s. The Antarctic had not, and now it was just completely wide open and pummeled.
Sad.
Mhm.
So here's a quick, as you can see, this is sort of a chart of the heyday of whaling. He was out, I put his time in the blue arrow at the top of the bars, but the bars show the great tape. He headed out in what this is, which is a bark, different from the North Schooner, because the back sail is gaff rigged. So he and 29 people lived on that for 3.5 years. They cruised down. This is a map for New Bedford, and I put it because it's very interesting that it really shows where whales were taken over most of the period. And you'll see his map in a minute, but he comes out of New Bedford, they go down and around, and then they go what's called along the line, which is the equator. The blue, which is interesting, the blue are the baleen whales, such as the right whale, which are the whales we see here off Provincetown. I mean, the right whale and the humpback and so forth, who characteristically, in the summers, obviously, reverse on the different polar regions. But in the summer region, go to the two poles and feed voraciously on krill and small fish, whether it's the Arctic or the Antarctic, right? And then they go back, in essence, to tropical islands where they both mate and calve. And so, you know, some of the well-known ones are the humpbacks that come out of Alaska where they feed during the summer, and they go down and they spend the winter in Hawaii. If you go down the same thing on the south side, there's whales that hang out, forget that map, there's whales that hang out down here in Antarctica, and they go up to New Zealand to mate and calve, or they go up around Cape Horn, or they go up around Cape Town off of Africa, and they're all different populations feeding around the ring of Antarctica, and you're the same thing off the south. And so, interestingly, early in the history of whaling, that they were all going after, the early whalers were going after the August ones, because you could, once you learned out where these islands were, once you learned where Hawaii was, you could just go there, and there were humpbacks again and again and again until you beat the crap out of the population. And then they lost interest and they jumped to the sperm whales. The sperm whales, whole different lifestyle. The sperm whales feed primarily on squid, and they feed on them off the continental shelf in 1,000 feet of water, which is why they have the oil in the head. But they also ring the oceans, and so that's why you see the sperm whales in red, sort of more spread out all around, and they basically live on the drops off the deep. And so during the heyday of whaling, they were all focused on the sperm whales and the oil. And then once oil's found, they went back to the baleen whales near the end. And this is actually his trip. He comes out in the Smyrna, New Bedford's up at the top. He goes around Cape Horn on his way out. He then goes up along the coast. As I said, he goes along the line, and then he spends 3 years just going up and down the Pacific Islands, mostly what are now known as the Marshall Islands at the top, Fiji in the middle, the Kermadec, which are a set of islands right here off New Zealand, and then he gets off on the North Island of New Zealand. And I write about it because I also think it's important in the history to understand, you know, Moby Dick makes it this great romantic thing. And then, of course, you look, as I pointed out, in the 20th century, when it's not really romantic, it's an awful thing. But in the Romantic era, killing a whale was a maritime bullfight, a long, drawn-out, and barbaric affair, quite similar in many ways to one of the classic Spanish pageants. As in the ring, there was a series of prescribed acts and an array of weapons, and the final estacada, or the plunging of the sword. Often a terrifying encounter, killing a great whale required superb skill, considerable strength, and good luck. After the whale was spotted, usually by a boat steerer in the crow's nest, who in tradition decried, "Thar she blows," upon seeing the white vaporous cloud of the spout, the captain ordered the boats lowered for the chase. Mostly rowed, the whale boats also had a small mast with a gaff-rigged sail that could be used to sneak up on a whale quietly, or after a long, unsuccessful chase, just to get the tired crew home. And then, of course, there was the dark work of actually whaling. Once you caught the whale and once you went through the Nantucket sleigh ride and all that stuff, you brought it back. I have a friend I grew up with who happened in the middle of her career to go into film research, and lo and behold, ended up working for Ken Burns for 15 years. She was one of those behind the scenes who finds all the great photos that he uses and makes his movie out of. And so she kindly offered to help. And she actually found for me the original, the earliest known black and white photographs taken of whaling. They're actually dated around 1905, so late in the period, but they're still doing sperm whales. So this is a classic sperm whale. They bring them in, the crew's out on the catwalk. Most of them are roped in. I don't know why they're not, but most of them are roped into a rope. You can see his right there, because if he slips on the catwalk when the whale is here, there's always sharks in the water, so that would be bad. So they have the rope to protect them. Here they are. The first thing that comes off a sperm whale is the head, because that's the most valuable. In a sperm whale, it is not just boiling down the blubber. The most valuable oil comes out separately, and it's in the head, because the whale puts a high manufactures itself, manufactures a very high grade of oil, which is the sonic component. And it's almost, if you will, a balloon of very pure oil in the forehead, which it uses both to amplify the sonic noises out that act as an acoustic sonar underwater. And that also bounces back and they can tell where the squid is. Because of course, when you're trying to catch a fleeing squid at 1,000 feet in black water, it's hard to see. It's dark as night. So that's why they're bringing in the head first to pull out that. And that would get barreled separately and specially marked because that was head oil. And that was then sold to early manufacturers who go into watches and high grade engineering needs. Then the rest of it would come in strips and they do the normal boiling down. Here's the try-works, which was the most dangerous aspect of whaling. The try-works was essentially a huge brick stove built on a wooden whaling ship. And, you know, they had the coal or wood underneath to get the pots going, and underneath are big black cauldrons, and you threw the chunks of blubber in and you boiled them down. And of course, crew members, you can't really see here, but underneath is a trough where water is fed to keep the bricks, the hot bricks elevated from the wooden deck. But if the water ever ran dry, ship would go like that. And there are numerous accounts where ships, you know, they'd see two ships would have gammed one night and they go whaling and they got whales over there and you're 10 miles over there and you're sort of over the horizon. And somewhere in the night, they see a flash of light and boom, gone. They go the next morning and it's just burnt oars blowing the water. Because of course, you know, if it goes so fast, burning hot oil, a wooden ship, it's gone in minutes. There's no firefighting equipment. There are no radios. They don't even get the boats off. I mean, it's so.
How often were ships go down for that? Was that a common occurrence?
It was pretty common. I mean, in the scheme of things, probably 10, 20 a year out of a fleet of several hundred.
It must have smelled terrible.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, it smelled really terrible. And black and gritty and all that stuff, yeah. So as I said, he spent most of his time, and where his story is the most interesting, I think, because it is really less about whaling, it's where he journeyed. And he journeyed, you know, deep into the South Pacific, as I said, his primary in the Marshall Islands, way up here, Fiji down here, the Kermadecks, this set of islands, and then he gets off, as I said, equally in New Zealand. What's fascinating was it's an interesting period of American history because it is expansionism. It is really also first contact. I mean, the whalers were the first contact for most of these islanders. Missionaries came in, you know, right behind them. And, you know, it was also horrible times because America did not act well. The first, you know, whalers were probably okay because they're more used to just trading and stuff, and they simply wanted fresh food, coconuts and so forth. And they, you know, there were incidents, but there were a lot of incidents over time with the various islanders. And then America's expansionism, and I tried to say out of politics, but Andrew Jackson was not too dissimilar in temperament to a recent president of ours with a sort of narcissistic, egomaniacal tendencies. And so, I mean, he in fact quietly sent out a Navy expedition that they told everybody was supposed to be discovering and laying claim to the Antarctic, but it didn't. What it really did was crisscross the Pacific and basically try to project a show of force on all the islands. And so it was not pretty.
Were there a number of islanders, if you will, however, who joined the ships in order to get away?
Later. I mean, sort of what happened in the heyday, you're jumping ahead, but that's fine. In the heyday, when he first went, it was still basically an all-American cruise. There were, of course, some Native Americans who were part of many of these crews. For the most part, they weren't picking up islanders. In his time, it moves up, and really by the time you hit the 1860s is when it fundamentally changed, and changed for two reasons. Three reasons, but we have three reasons, if you will. But, you know, one is once the gold rush occurs in 1849, that takes out a whole pool of, young quote unquote Americans who want to do this stuff when they could rather go to the Klondike and try to make it rich. The Civil War takes out a whole pool of workers, if you will. And then the final nail, so to speak, on the American involvement in the labor side ends up being, you know, when oil is discovered. And therefore the price of whale oil plummets. Therefore, you know, it's hard to pay them. And so at that point, the whole labor force dramatically shifts and much better lives. They do, and in his counts, they do pick up a bunch of islanders, mostly as they start off with sort of all American crew, and as people leave, as he said, by the time he gets off his ship, 3.5 years later, he and the one guy he leaves with, the only two left. Everyone else has rotated out, but some of them only signed up to go one way or the other. So it's a melange, if you will. So one of the fascinating things he also comes across, and I think to me, the richest part of his story is not the whaling at all. It's much more about these first contacts and incidents he gets involved in. One's a mutiny. He stumbles on a mutiny and writes, "There was a Portuguese who had boarded us several times when we were off Drummond Island," which is up in the marshes, so it's up here. "From him we learned that Captain Hussey, who we met at Strong Island," which is over here, when we lay there during June and July of 1851, had shot one of his crew when he was captain of the planter of New Bedford. On account of that, he feared to return to America, so he took refuge on Strong Island. After we left there, the brig William Penn from California came in, and in some way Captain Hussey got possession of her and fitted her out for a whaling voyage and shipped a crew consisting of 4 white men and a number of Kanakas, islanders, from Oahu, Patience, and Strong Island. One of his boat steerers was a Tahitian named Harry, a man of large and powerful frame, who became the ringleader of the gang. One night about a month ago, when the brig was near Simpson Island, as the captain came on deck, he and the cook were killed, and the first mate and one of the men severely wounded. The 4 white men were sleeping below, and the Fijian Kanakas, headed by the Tahitian, took everything of value they could find, and arming themselves and lowering the two boats, they steered a course southeast, which brought them to this island. Now, what was fascinating, something you could not have done 10 years ago, I didn't go online to sort of, okay, I got enough proper nouns, names, I should be able to, you know, can I find anything to back this up, or is he just making this stuff up? And I actually find the autobiography written by the nephew of the captain who was in the mutiny. And the young lad had left Nantucket with his uncle and sailed out on this voyage and recounts, you know, how he'd been. His uncle was a stern guy. He did in fact have a sort of mutiny over meat. It was very much like Mutiny on the Bounty. You know, if you remember the part where they all rebel over the bad, what they call the bad food or the bad stew or something. So the captain tried to make them eat a barrel of bad meat that had been split open and was green and smelled, right? So they all were like, no. And then he said, yes, you will. And they said, no, we won't. And they had this big back and forth. And then finally, they're all at one end of the ship and he's at the other. And he says, you know, one of you come forward. And the guy he thinks is, he pulls out his pistol, he shoots him straight in the head. And so there's a debate, was the guy mutiny or did the captain just kill him? And so the nephew says, my uncle knew he would be tried when we went back. And sure enough, they did. So the uncle gets off and stays there, which is how he then gets in this story. But the nephew wrote this whole account and he was there when all this happened. And I could actually find it online because someone had digitized this like 1849 book, you know, and you could, again, it's sort of like going to Bedford Library and find the logs. It totally dovetails and brings out the whole story. So, you know, it's a fascinating and true account, and very rare to find someone who's in the middle of it, write some of this stuff. And then the other sort of more equally gruesome aspect, as I said, relates to the sort of American expansionism. Some of the other things that came up along the way were, one, Rob, my grandfather, Rob's casual tone here makes it almost impossible to skim over, makes it possible to skim over 2 intertwined and truly horrific events that took place. events that certainly weren't unique among whalers. The stark truth is that after unhappy sailors deserted the ship, Captain Hobbs kidnaps two unwitting islanders and forces them aboard, a capital crime. Then, culturally isolated, their hair cut off, they are made to undertake hard labor. And they, of course, are totally terrified. After just 20 days, the Cantabrians, which is an island in Fiji, threw themselves overboard, gathering that they could swim an amazing distance ashore. They, in fact, survived a 30+ mile swim, but were then killed and eaten because they had the bad luck to land on an island that was not their own. And cannibalism was still fairly common in the Fijis.
Right.
So that's sort of what's going on up there. The other aspect that he stumbles on, it's, you know, when the crews all get together every once in a while, they gam with the other whaling ships, what they all like to talk about when crews were taken and ships taken down, and they have various terms for ships that are the native islanders rise up and attack them. Well, in fact, I probably spent more time on this than anything else because it was sort of such a deep a deep notion in all of their gamming stories and his tales, and they were also worried about how they were treated by islanders. But when you read into them, and I followed at least a dozen of the different stories, all of them started with Americans, maybe a few Europeans, but Americans behaving badly. And all of them started, basically any ship of the day would pull into an island and they were there to trade, knife blades and fish hooks and whatever might be for fresh coconuts and fresh fruit, and maybe a pig or a goat if you were lucky. But often trading got out of hand. And in the South Pacific, different cultures, different mores, certainly ethnocentric from a European American point of view, sex was part of the equation. And it's not clear in many cases whether the native islander men offered their women or whether the women thought it was okay or not okay. I'm not gonna ever get into judgment of it, but clear that was part of it. But where it would spiral out of control is very quickly, someone would either grab a female islander and, go somewhere on the island with them, or they, worse, put them in a whale ship, in a whaleboat, try to take them back to the ship. And then, of course, male islanders came out and said, that's my wife, that's my sister, and it all blew up. And so, a simple trading thing turned into kidnapping and then ultimately murder. And then on the heels of all this, I said, Martin Van Buren, President Van Buren, sent out, and he was a Andrew Jackson protege, sent out this guy called Captain Hudson and Peacock in this great expedition. They were supposed to discover Antarctica and lay claim to it. The ice kept them off Antarctica, so they never got there, and they crisscrossed the Pacific, and they would go to all the islands where they had reported of these things, and no investigation, no asking questions. They were like, we were told Chief so-and-so did this, produce him, and we're gonna take him away in irons. And when they didn't produce him, or the chief ran off into the hills, they summarily would fire at all the natives on the shore, killing, tens of them. So far from any kind of justice, inquisition, any effort made, they would just shoot them. And if that wasn't enough, then they would turn around and they would torch the villages. And so they were actually known as the Burning Fleet at the end. And they were only there a few years before Armstrong shows up with his whaling, and so the whalers would walk into some of these islands, some places where obviously they hadn't been, they had fine trading and they got coconuts for fish hooks. Other whale ships would go into certain islands where they had just been, and their crews would be similarly slaughtered by the islanders because there was still retribution, because the last people who came just killed everybody in our village. So it was a sort of chilling mayhem as a result of American sort of, at the very least, blind ethnocentric cultural craziness, if you will, of the period. And then after sailing for, I think it's roughly 4 years, 4.5 years, 3.5 years, he decides he hasn't made any money. They've only gotten so many whales, and it's not worth it. And he's tired, but he's not ready to go home. And the ship is about to head home. They're going to make one last stop in New Zealand and revictual, that is, get fresh food, fresh meat, so they can make their cruise home with their oil. And he decides to get off. So he gets off in New Zealand, And I will point out, there's another map in a minute, but Auckland, this is just the North Island, and Auckland is up in that middle arrow. He will be up north, and then he comes down south, and he gets off, and he basically spends the next 4 years logging, and he first logs, who's been out to California and seen a sequoia tree? Big sequoia trees, they're huge. You know, a sequoia dwarfs almost these, but this is actually smaller, and then, you know, they're huge. So they log those, and those only grow in the north part of North Island, but he logs those for about 1.5 years. And then says it's too tiring and all that stuff, and so he switches and goes down to the south part of the island. Get that one out of the way. All right. We'll come back. No, I didn't get that
I
one.
hate to be rude. I'm enjoying this so much. I have to be someplace at 2:30.
Pleasure, glad you made it.
It was wonderful.
Good.
Thank you.
So he then goes down and he logs on the south side of the island and lives among the Maoris. And he, you know, writes about in great depth about the Maoris. And again, that's almost the first contact kind of exchange that he leaves us with, which is fascinating.
How old is he now?
25-ish.
Jeez.
He's lived a long life.
Yes, look, an awful lot.
Yeah, yeah.
You'd have to be young to wait, I mean, to.
And then having done all this, I of course could not help but, and we're almost there. We have 3 readings to go. I could of course not help, and wanted to go. After spending so much time reading Rob's writing and researching his voyage, I developed a deep desire to tread in his path. I felt compelled to see some of what he saw, smell the tang of the ocean, feel the impact of great waves on a ship's bow, travel far from home. And while I might have sought to pick up his trail among the romantic palms of the South Pacific, amid his tale, Rob wrote, quote, "Someone heaved a coconut shell overboard today, and it had scarcely touched the water before a bird of the petrel kind had lighted on it. There he was, a small sailor in a small frail bark, alone on the heaving ocean," end quote. The image that Rob evoked pierced my soul and wrapped my psyche. It connected me with a side of Rob I had not seen. So instead, I set my heart for somewhere quite different, somewhere wilder. And so with that, this is actually a picture of me in the Falkland Islands. But I subsequently went on 2 trips, one around the Horn and then one off New Zealand. And, you know, I'm born and raised, been a birder for all my life, so that's really what I wanted to see. These are interesting, because you may know that if you've been off Provincetown, these are Wilson's storm petrels, which probably one of the most populous birds in the world, as you don't know, because they're out at sea, and they all nest down in Antarctica, and we all see them up here during their quote unquote winter season down there, and they're up here feeding, and they, you know, do a figure 8 across the Atlantic back up and down. The other one is a ash-mantled sooty albatross, probably one of the most rare in the world, and actually one of the most in peril, because they tend to be caught by what they call longliners. So when ships go off and they're trying to catch large fish out in the ocean, deep ocean, they set out long lines with hooks that are spaced, and these guys
Swordfish.
are particularly susceptible to them.
Oh, it's terrible.
So anyway, I went with a group. The first one around Cape Horn, I want to say, was an incredible cruise. My wife to this day thinks I am an idiot, because I went and I was fascinated. I really just wanted to see the birds. I want to go around Cape Horn. So I looked it up, and there was a bird group that we had this great trip, and we leave Montevideo, we go around Cape Horn, and we bring you back, and we drop you off in Santiago, Chile. And I was like, that's just awesome, because you go down the Atlantic, so you see the Atlantic pelagic seabirds, and then you come up in the Pacific on the Humboldt Current, you see the Pacific ones, and in between you're off Cape Horn in Drake's Passage, the great funnel of all the birds of the world. And you know, what was cool was it was with the small groups of like whatever that is, 20 of us. We were on a much larger real cruise ship. But they gave us our own deck, so we had our own world, and it was spectacular. I signed up months in advance, 3 days before I'm going. My wife finally looks it up and she goes, "You know, you're going to Antarctica." Like, what? I had not paid attention. to the, somewhere in there, we go south from Cape Horn for 3 days, we go down and we bang along the coast of Antarctica, we come back up. I was like, at the last minute, so grateful. She shook my head, that I, had thrown in down jackets, some extra, green.
One of the most dangerous places in the world. to be,
Yeah, but it's a-
actually.
Yeah, but it's a big ship, so, but we hit one storm that rocked the dining room. I mean, it was a Princess Cruise Lines. It's a small ship because it still fits in the Panama Canal, but it's like, it takes 800 people. There were like 600 on it. But I mean, there was one night we were caught by the storm off Humboldt Current going off Chile. And it trashed. I mean, the dining room, people were going like this and the trays went crazy and the whole bit. But in any event.
Excitement.
Oh, yeah, memorable.
And then equally, I had to then, a year later, COVID, so maybe it was a year and a half, because COVID had occurred. I went down to New Zealand. I don't know if you've been there, but there's North and South Island. And what most attracted me again was the birds. And off here is actually where the ship's followers, the original diorama that I fell in love with the Museum of History was based off Snares Island. So I wanted to do that, and then I wanted to follow his footsteps. And in New Zealand, he was less clear on his first stop, where he logged these great trees, but they only grow north of about here. And so I sort of identified a heavy near Warkworth. And then he was much more specific on the second, after a year and a half there, he came down, he settled down, and he was very detailed where he lived and worked here in Waiora on Hawke's Bay. And I could go there and you'll see that in a minute. And now it's equally fascinating to really be in his footsteps. So far from home, 160 plus years later.
What did he do now that he wasn't on the sea for a living?
Eventually he went back and ran a store. He picked up, from his uncles. So this is down in Hawke's Bay in Waiora. And I drove through this long mountain range to get there in pouring rain. I thought I was gonna go over the edge of these cliffs. I cannot tell you how horrific and scary it was. And it was just a little dirt gravel road, no signs. You're like, am I on the right road? I could be like miles off. I'm watching my gas tank go down, blah, 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 the whole thing. I finally pop out. And of course, if you're in New Zealand, the top of the mountain ridges sort of have some of the original forest left. Everything else has been cleared. They're either forest plantation been planted, or it's of course all wide open fields for the sheep and now cattle and so forth. But at last, also when I pop out of this field in front of me, I'm like, oh, thank God, I made, the other side. And I still only go an hour, but I end up, I first come out, this stream joins this river. And that intersection is about 5 miles above this picture. That day, the way off was frothing madly, fresh from the rain I had driven through. Filled with grayish clay-sized sediment, the water swirled downstream with an opaque silvery hue, colored like glacial outwash. The hills around were crisscrossed with low barbed wire fences, and each section was filled with sheep or lowing cattle. While the only trees near at hand were a dozen huge weeping willows lining the stream bank. The great visual discontinuity in time between the forest that had been on the site in Rob's day and the cleared pastures now didn't really matter, for I was here today. I had returned along his path to a fairly precise spot, 160 years after he left. I felt his presence in the cold rain then, standing beside me. I pictured him thinking it an imprudent mission, a solipsistic goal. But then I knew he would have cracked a smile and chuckled at my audacity, and mostly been moved that someone still cared. I broke out my stashed bottle of Lefroy, sat on the fence line in the pouring rain, and hoisted a peaty toast to him. I drank to his life, to his run in the great game, and to his progeny, of course. But it's fascinating that, more importantly, you get down to visit town of Waiora, and he describes that when they came, there's no one there but Maoris and 1 or 2 European traders. And one of them is called Lockwood. And that's the guy who then introduces them to the Maori chief of the region, who lives across the river from him. And that guy says, oh, you can go up here, you can go to the first tributary offshoot, and you can log there and we'll let you be. Well, when you stand, and I'm standing, this is actually right here, a bridge in the middle of town, the town is sort of behind, and this is looking upriver. That is to this day, Lockwood Point, and that to this day is the Maori equivalent of church community center, if you will, where the sheep lived, and it's all right there, and you know exactly where he stood. And I could go up, and he clearly describes where we are at the first tributary, it's 5 miles up, measure the crow flies, and that's the first tributary that comes in. So it was sort of amazing and fascinating and cool to be able to go back 160 years and be there, and then realize, here this poor guy is, he's left drunk, he's left with no friends, no family, no one's talked to him. He's 7 years out, more or less, he's here. His family doesn't know he's alive. No one knows he's alive. He has no friends, really. I mean, the one guy he's sort of blogging with, who he's only made a friend with recently, he doesn't yet think he's ready to go home if he is gonna go home. He is as far as he can be on the opposite side of the planet to where he is.
And he's poor.
I mean, and it's amazing to think about how lonely, in a way, scared and terrified and all that he must have been. It's amazing to think that he made it back. It was very, poignant to me, at least, to be there to think about all those things. And then, of course, I said I couldn't help myself, so I had to go off on the trip south.
Are these your photos?
Yes, these are my photos. And I won't run you all the way back, but if you remember the original one and the diorama in the Museum of History has, all these birds. It's one of those things you think when you visit a museum, and the diorama is particularly Museum of Natural History, but any great museum, you look at me like, okay, that's cool, but it's compressed, it's made up, that's artistic. They're trying to show all the animals, together. And then you realize when you actually get there, I mean, whatever this is, I mean, there's 7 species, all they're still there, amazing, all the different things you see at the far end of the world. And here's more or less, I think, second last. For a moment, let us put the tangible elements of Rob's journey aside, and of all the things Rob saw and did, and instead examine the heart of his tale. Let us pause to contemplate the complicated aurora of Rob's epiphany, arguably the seminal event and the zenith of his journey. It is when he finally understands his own potential. It is when he wrote his own gospel. At long last, on March 5th, 1859, under the Southern Cross, still more than 12,000 miles from home, Rob saw the light. The site is marked with a cross on his own map. The cross marks the day when he prevailed over all the gods haunting his past and came to realize that his God, his potential, had been there all along, like the magic of Dorothy's shoes. As Dorothy did, he finally came to understand that only he could forgive himself and find his way home. And that capacity was one he had always had. And indeed, he bought a Bible, and I won't go too deep into it, but I actually devote a chapter because one of the things I did also find in the trunk was my grandfather. So the person who's midway between the two of us had got a law degree, but in getting his law degree, he wrote a paper on his view of Christ and religion and so forth. And it's interesting, just to say the least, when you look at Rob's journey, when he sort of starts out, I mean, a little simplistic and trying to say because I know I'm on thin ice with the religion, but he starts out with sort of an Old Testament view of God. And he finally comes to a New Testament, if you will, view of God, where there is forgiveness and the forgiveness is him and so forth. And then, then I look at my grandfather, the person in between us, who ultimately was a very secular person, but equally was brought up in his home. So had sort of a very strong background and wrote his take on God and so forth. And then finally, I will briefly, touch a little briefly on mine, but it's sort of interesting, if nothing else, from an academic point of view, to look at sort of a, religion over 5 generations and how it shifts and how people view essentially the same works. I'll leave it at that, but I think I thought it was interesting and so forth. And then, of course, the final final chapter, you know, there's a discussion of conservation and, it's my belief when I went back and read it, and as I hit some of these elements, I then went back and reread his story again and again. And I sort of came to the conclusion that by the time he's in his sixties, he was smart enough to self-edit and leave out things that he thought he probably should. One of the ones that comes up is the Galapagos. When he heads out on his voyage, they stop off in the Galapagos Islands for about 10 days. All the whalers in that period stopped off at the
Oh
Galapagos
my.
to take the turtles and stack them on board and handle them. I mean, it's so awful when you read. I mean, they took them, they ate a few there, most of them they took live, of course, they stacked them upside down.
Yeah.
Dry tortoises, I mean, tortoises from a dry island don't need a lot of water and so forth, they would last for months. They, you know, they didn't give them water, they didn't feed them, they just left them and then they were fresh meat from, I mean, the whole thing was awful. Slaughtering grounds, the numbers have been wiped out, five out of the 17 species, so forth. And then you also, you know, he never talked about whaling itself. Barely, I mean, I talk more about it in the bullfight discussion than he ever talks about it, so I know he sort of self-edited that. God bless him, and I think he realized later in life, he had a successful sword, good marriage, he rose back in the church, he was a member of the vestry, and clearly thought, okay, I think, what it is, he's clearly, okay, those are things we don't need to discuss. And one of the things that, to me, is, you know, touching nowadays, the danger, you know, thank God in the 70s, we stopped whaling pretty much. But now what goes on, you know, krill is being harvested, or in this case, the Chinese have a fleet of something like 250 of these squid boats that go out. And it's hard to imagine, but these are motor driven, each one is a motor driven rod, heavy monofilament line with a squid hook. They go out at night, they shine the light down, the squid rise to it, and these barbed hooks go in an endless cycle and pull up all the calamari in the world we want, but it's feeding billions of people. But I mean, we're of course endangering them, not by just putting them now, we're just like take all the food away. And there's really, you know, very few areas set aside, so on and so forth, for that. And so the final reading is across the globe, the religious, and this is my personal take by deep concerns, across the globe, the religious and political ideological warfare of the current era has obscured, if not distracted us, from the infinitely more necessary goal of a sustainable and biologically diverse planet. From scientists and conservationists to government officials, the politically active already seem to have accepted a vision of a future Earth with pint-sized nature preserves and zoos augmented with cryonic preservation. Some nations, not even that. Unceasing population growth and commensurate development are apparently foregone conclusions, politically too intractable to tackle. The ultimate tragedy of the commons. Propelled by extremes in politics and overwhelmed by religious fervor, the conservation agenda has buckled from its focus on biodiversity and ecosystem preservation. We have capitulated from a vision of a future where humans would sustainably exist alongside our fellow species on Earth to one of unchecked human dominance. And so, get a little conservation in the final query. And then, I think that's that. People always ask about the whole writing process, for those who care. You know, quick one was, you know, finding an idea, in my case, the research backbone. I mean, in my case, the idea happened to be this gift of 100-page manuscript, which I said really had to be out there. I will tell you what my original plan was simply just to go to like New Bedford Whaling Museum or Nantucket or Mystic Seaport, or they would do an in-house press and just put it out there. And then several people said it's really too interesting. And when I did the background research, I was like, there's so much more to fill out these stories and add in. And then I reached out and found an agent who said, okay, I don't do this, but I will, but here's a suggestion. And I never go forward into any author of mine has now also works with either a ghostwriter or an editor to have really a whole independent eye. And I did, and that person screwed up the manuscript and I had to redo it, but they did have a brilliant idea, or their point was, that it would probably have more interest if I opened it up and included more of myself, which is why you got me. And it was their idea to make it more personal and it would be a better read. So I sort of did that, and then after that, then you go back and that was sort of, then you sit down and that was sort of in that stage, and then by the time you go back and you compose the whole thing and go through the flow and full edit. These days, the publishing houses, you don't really get an editor. I was foolish, and then I grew up with this thought of, Ernest Hemingway and Scribner, and I forget his great Perkins, his great editor, and they all work together for you when they do the marketing. Well, none of that happens now. With everything digitized, publishing is so changed that they basically, I said, so who fact checks? They're like, well, you fact check. I said, I wrote it. How can I fact check? They're like, no, you're responsible for fact check. They don't even do that anymore. So you sort of do all that. Then get the thing out, and I was lucky and found interest and got it out with a great publisher, Lawrence Press. So, and we're going into a paperback next year. So
from the idea to marketing, press and tours, how many years?
from finding the manuscript. In my case, I found the manuscript. I probably took a year, half a year to digitize it, clean it up. Go back and look at the other logbooks and get the one logbook from Nantucket and add a few things in and then double check all the names and stuff. I then probably then it was 2-3 years of them doing all the research on the outside and bringing the context in. And then it was probably a 4th year, or whatever it was in there, just going back and redoing the flow and working with the editor, and then was accepted. And then even between acceptance, I probably re-edited twice more, but not heavily, but I moved around actually a chapter or two. And then it also went to New Zealand and stuck that in, which was a little difficult, but so the whole thing was probably about 5 years.
Yeah.
And then it's another, then they take it in January, it doesn't come out until September. So, it's quite the process. And that's it. So thank you very much for coming. For those who are still on Zoom, thank you for coming. And if you have any questions?
For the generations after you to know about their family.
Yeah, and that was a good piece of it, and then one of the nicer things, my son was at first upset, and then he was like, okay, I get it, Dad. Was I also then took all the stuff and thought very carefully in the process. As I said, my mother's still alive, but she had a trunk with some stuff. Her brother, my uncle, also had some stuff. And that included things like the whaler's ship's clock, a quilt that his wife, who was also in the military business, made in 1870 something, some even 1820 stuff and so forth. So I took all that as a collection and then spent a good bit of time trying in New Bedford. They were not interested, but ended up finding the Historical Society, but it's a large, well-funded one for the state of Maryland. And since he was in Baltimore, they took all that. So they actually ended up with the original manuscript and stuff, but put it all together as a collection.
Whalers' wives went on board and lived with them and
Yeah.
made quilts.
Yeah. So, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.